In recognition of all frontline healthcare workers, Rogers Sports and Media is saying thank you and we appreciate you. Our frontline warriors continue to have our backs throughout COVID, so it's time for us to have theirs. Want to know how you can help? You can purchase a t-shirt for $30, a t-shirt and mask combo for $40, or a 10-pack of masks for $90. Proceeds will be going to the Frontline Fund, frontlinefund.ca, which supports 150 hospital foundations across Canada. These hospital foundations provide supplies and support for healthcare professionals who put themselves ahead of others to ensure our safety and well-being. For more information, check out hashtag Hearts and Smiles on Instagram or go to the website heartsandsmiles.ca. Welcome to another edition of Let's Be Perfectly Queer here on Rogers TV Barrie. I've got a very special guest with me tonight. We've gone outside of our normal range of Simcoe Muskoka to bring you a guest all the way from Windsor, Ontario. Jayce Carver is the founder and executive director of Windsor-Essex Transgender and Allied Support, the first trans-focused and trans-led organization in Canada. Jayce and her team work to enhance and sustain the health and well-being of transgender, genderqueer, two-spirited, gender non-binary, and gender questioning communities by providing programs and support services. Jayce has spent many years advocating for equality while sitting on the board of the Windsor Pride Community, the City of Windsor Diversity Committee, and Adult Protection Services Ontario. Her early work made her aware of the inequities, even amongst pride communities, faced by trans folks. This has induced a passion for her to help raise the voice of her community in larger LGBTQ movements. Please join me in welcoming to the show my friend, Jayce Carver. Jayce, welcome.
Thank you, Randy. How are you today?
I am doing very well. Really happy to have you on the show. I know we've talked about this for a while now, about getting you on, and certainly it makes it a little bit easier now that we've sort of gone the Skype route. And I think that's one of the good things that's come out of the pandemic, being able to set up these sort of interviews and other meetings and things that I know you've been on just like me for the last 2 months. And it's certainly a new way to talk to folks and spread our reach beyond just our small bubble in our community. So let's start by giving you a bit of a platform here and telling us about the Jayce Carver story.
So again, my name is Jayce Carver, and as you said, I founded Canada's first center specifically focused on supporting trans-identified people and their families, and that was kind of born out of my own need for services and support. I've told this story at least 100 times in the last few years. And I find that it never absolutely just gets easier to tell because it's so deeply rooted in this story of trying to find who I am, story of loss and success, triumph and failure, and that story continues to unfold daily, right? And so I think oftentimes people like myself and yourself, we have there's this expectation put on us by society and by our community because we are willing to speak out, that we set the stage always for telling these stories, right? And at times that could feel empowering, and at times that could feel very isolating and lonely. But my story started really simply at the age of 4, knowing that there was something different about me. Being raised in a very religious household, Roman Catholic, Jehovah's Witness, whoa, and also a very addictive and abusive household. And so I knew that there was something different about me at that age. I had an older brother and a younger sister. I didn't see the difference between my younger sister and I just knew that I was nothing like my older brother. I thought he was disgusting. Boys generally are. And so I told my mom at that time that I didn't understand why I was being treated differently than my sister, that we were the same. And I knew that was met with a lot of resistance, and I was told the difference between boys and girls, and it was all based on biology. And I knew in that moment that I had a responsibility, and that responsibility was, in order to be loved, I had to become whatever was necessary for my mom to be able to accept me and love me. So I needed to man up, essentially, and I needed to learn how to hide the pieces of myself that were unacceptable in the eyes of my mom and in the eyes of our faith base. And that went throughout my childhood, and that attitude in relationships poured over into every relationship that I had. I became very codependent. I learned to be a chameleon, to be whatever I needed to be in order to fit into whatever circle I needed to fit in to keep myself safe.
That takes a lot of work.
It is a lot of work, and especially at the age of 4, to realize that you have a responsibility to change yourself. That and that story is not a story that is not relatable to most trans-identified people, and even to queer people. You know, when we notice that we're outside of what is acceptable or the norm, we take on this responsibility to change ourselves, and so instead of hoping that society will change or to exact change in society. And I still see that with many of the folks that our agency works with today.
And that seems like a very, very early age to recognize that too, 4 years old, as opposed to, you know, most of the folks that I speak to, and certainly my own story of self-awareness, that idea of sexuality and gender and those differences didn't start coming into play in my mind until much, much later, you know, just sort of the prepubescent ages. So that's a lot to carry for a 4-year-old.
In our work, we find that gender identity exposes itself or starts to be prevalent at a far younger age, 4 to 7, and that sexual identity is around puberty age, just prepubescent age.
Sure.
So
Okay.
we're finding that there's a lack of resources and a lack of understanding around gender identity, and it's because it's not been studied as well as it needs to be. And so oftentimes young kids are going unsupported when they start to talk about gender identity or the difference between their genders. And there's still a lack of acceptance amongst families, right, and communities.
Well,
so we're still,
the binary is still considered the norm, right? The idea of gender on a spectrum is still very foreign, and that definitely needs to be highlighted in our communities much more.
Absolutely. It started to this idea of needing to be something and to try to find a role for myself that was acceptable. It reared its head again in the 90s, right? When you started to see Ellen DeGeneres come out of the closet and Will and Grace be aired on TV, it started to become a little bit more mainstream to identify as gay. And so when I had met my then partner, Stephen, at the age of 17 years old in the 90s, so I'm aging myself.
Trust me.
Yeah. So when I met him, I thought, well, ding, 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 my knight in shining armor. I can get out of this abusive household. I could choose an identity, because I thought I could choose to be gay. I could choose an identity that is more in line with what I may feel, even though I knew it was dishonest. And I can engage in this relationship and we could live happily ever after. And I did that for a very, very long time, you know. And so I just thought, now I can just choose to become whatever he needs me to be in order to be loved and accepted. And I did that for so many years. And it wasn't until 2012. Oh, you got something going on. So it wasn't until like 2012. Yeah. 2012, I started to see people not on Jerry Springer pulling out each other's waves that were trans. I started to see some people who were daring to be vulnerable and tell their story. And I did some research and I started to find out more about the Pride movement and how it was started by a trans woman of color. I had no idea that was true as I was living as a white gay man with my privilege, no offense, in society. I thought every story I had seen was about gay men starting this riot and forging forward the modern day Pride movement. I had no idea that this amazing trans woman of color actually was the leader of our current day modern Pride movement. No idea. And so when I started to see that she dared to live boldly, she dared to be courageous every single day, knowing that she could not know the outcomes of what was to take place in her life, but she dared to speak out, and that for people like me to have an opportunity to live freely. And so in 2012, I started to look for the resources I needed in order to start my transition. I'm going to tell you, in my community, there was nothing. There was nothing. Even our Pride organization at the time, and no offense to our Pride organization, I was on the board of directors of it at the time when I was looking for these resources. Even our own Pride organization had a very slim understanding of trans identified people. There was only a few people accessing that space. I found that they were being tokenized, their stories were being told, but there was no resources or programs being created that would really support their needs and get them connected in the larger LGBT community or even amongst themselves. And so, I'm going to tell you, my life fell apart. I lived in fear. I lived in fear of losing the job that I worked so hard to get and the career I worked so hard to create. I lived in fear that my marriage would end, and along with my marriage would go my complete identity, because it's all I knew was being a partner. I feared that my own community would ostracize me because I saw how other trans people were being treated in the LGBT community. I stood beside other gay men at the clubs while they made fun of the tranny in the bar, excuse the expression, but I stood beside them while they did that. And I thought, this will never be a safe space for me to exist. And so I started the process anyway, though. Back then, it was like, you see a psychiatrist, you're told you're crazy, you start hormone replacement therapy. And so I started that process, and unfortunately the psychiatrist I went to just didn't believe that we existed, you know? So I was prescribed a lot of medication, and I became addicted to those medications. And I ended up with substance use disorder. That's what we call it today. I think it's so much nicer than the coining people an addict and keeping them stuck in their problem instead of in their solution.
Yep.
And within no time at all, I had no job. I was off on sick leave. I was separated from my marriage. I was living in my car, unable to get into emergency shelter that would be safe for somebody who was self-identifying and not on hormone replacement therapy. And I was a slave to my pain. Sorry.
No, take your time. Listen, this is an important story, because I know we're talking about you and your experiences in Windsor-Essex, a different part of our province. But I don't think it's a story that isn't relevant for folks living here in Simcoe, Muskoka, or any other part of Ontario, or quite frankly, right across the country, right? This lack of resources for folks who really need it. And I think that's why it's so important to have someone like you be brave enough, like Marsha P. Johnson. You're not picking up a stone and throwing it at Stonewall and the cops, but you are, in a sense, you know, you're picking up a metaphorical stone anyway and throwing it at the powers that be and saying, this is what we need. This is what my community needs. This is how we save lives. And being as brave as you are to share those stories, because I get it. You know, I get how painful it can be to share personal stories.
I know you do.
About your journey, which is why I don't often, you know, I sort of gloss over my story. I don't get into all the weeds like you do. So I think that's incredibly brave that you do that. So whatever you need, the time you need to take, do it. So, and I think you're ready to move on. So I'll shut up now and let you go back to it.
So I just, you know, I became a slave to my pain. I became a slave to the lack of self-worth. I became a slave to the narrative that society wanted me to have. The narrative that society decides for folks like us, that I must be mentally ill, I must be incapable, I will live below the poverty line, I will always be alone, I will always be erased. Like this was my internal dialogue on a daily basis. And when you don't have housing, and you don't have human connection, and even in recovery circles, you're finding yourself ostracized and put on the outside of what is the norm, you start to look for only areas where you cannot connect. Mm-hmm. And then that becomes your cycle, your self-fulfilling prophecy. And until I decided that was no longer going to be my story. You know, I went to a treatment facility, West Sober Treatment Center, and I always give them a lot of credit because they work hard. They worked very hard. And I was the first pre-hormone trans woman to attend that treatment facility that they know of, that was willing to say, you know, like, you got to provide me some services. And that was in late 2015. And, you know, I don't feel like I necessarily got the experience going there that I should have, like the same experience as everybody else. And it's because I wasn't ready.
Sure.
I didn't have this level of self-acceptance that recovery requires. This level of ability to be honest about what my innermost feelings, fears, thoughts are in order to be able to do the journey of healing
Yeah,
that
that's
I
key.
needed to be on, right? And so I went back out for another full year, suicide attempts, trying to get into treatment. Local treatment center here, in Windsor, kept on denying me access to services, and then I finally was like, enough is enough, right? Like I'm supposed to be doing, and I was on hormones at this point. It was September 24th of 2015. I started hormone replacement therapy, and that took some manipulation. I went to a whole nother city and made up some stories. And let's be honest, some of us girls have to do that stuff, and
Absolutely.
a lot of our folks back, and that's not even uncommon today, to try to find healthcare practitioners that's willing to see us as who we are. And I remember this doctor in London having a bad reputation for just overprescribing and being like, ding, 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 that's where I'm going. And I walked out 5 minutes later with high doses of estrogen, and I was like, I'm about to arrive, right? And so this treatment facility just kept on denying me services. And at this point, I was starting to see myself look back at me in the mirror. I was starting to see her, and I knew she could exist. And I was willing to do anything I could to fight for that girl. And so I filed the first application, Ontario Human Rights application, for denial of access for services based on gender identity against a treatment facility. And it took 2 years, but I did win that and did develop their trans-inclusive policy. That still didn't mean I was sober. That still didn't mean, and I don't think sobriety is, like 100% abstinence-based sobriety is necessarily everybody's journey anyway. I have no judgment on people's journey to recovery and healing. And I'm going to tell you, my story has not been straightforward sobriety, and my story keeps getting told that way. But I'm glad to have this platform today to tell the truth, you know. I went back to Westover for a relapse prevention program, finally fully included in the women's treatment program. And I felt like someone finally was providing me treatment. Jayce Carver, me. And I started my journey of healing. I started to go back to that inner child, that little girl at the age of 4 that was told she couldn't exist. And I told her everything was going to be okay.
Yeah.
Not only will you exist, but you will love yourself, and you will find yourself through this process. And gratefully, I did get some sobriety out of that, you know. And during that portion of sobriety I founded my organization, and it started with just a 1-800 number, my car, and a cell phone. And all I wanted to do, because I'm a firm believer, to keep what you have, you must give it to somebody else who is exactly where you were at the time that you were at your most desperate. You need to give that hope away to somebody. And that's how you maintain your hope. That's how you maintain your gratitude for your life. And so I started that. I started meeting with folks, and then it just kind of kept growing. And then we got our first space in May of 2018, 1,000 square foot, small little drop-in location. I started writing programs. They started to expand. And then this past November, we got the 3,000 square foot space on Tecumseh Road East here in Windsor, which is an LGBT, and we expanded to an LGBTQ community health and wellness center. Now, we're still not a well-funded organization. I still get out there and I do whatever I got to do to make stuff. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to swear on Rogers, to make stuff happen. But in that process, I find that, you know, there's an expectation that's put on us as advocates and community leaders. I never asked to be a community leader, by the way. I just wanted to right some wrongs that happened in my own life. I just wanted to make sure that other trans people wouldn't have to go through the process that I went through, or even if they did, they would have somebody like them to tell them it was going to be okay at the end of the day. And so I feel like, and I'm grateful for it, but I was given a platform, but then I was put on a pedestal at the same time. And there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that pedestal, you know, and I'm not ungrateful for that pedestal, because that pedestal provides me a platform in order to be able to be heard. And I'm grateful that as a trans person, people take me seriously. I'm invited to tables that generally we're not invited to. My voice holds weight. But at the same time, my story is being told in a way that I never told it. I did not go from homeless to completely set in my life and everything is fantastic. I didn't go from rags to riches. I still live at a very modest income, still fighting for a grassroots organization to have its footing. With my story being told that way came the responsibility of feeling that I needed to be perfect again. So I was going back into this old narrative that somehow my truth didn't matter anymore. The truth that people needed to hear was the only truth that mattered. Mm-hmm. And my relationships started to suffer. And, I was married to Stephen for 21 years, gay man. And about a year and a half into my transition, I started feeling my marriage start to separate. We stopped communicating. We weren't spending time together. I was focused completely on the building of this organization, right. And I was obsessed with trying to make sure that this was had a stakehold in our community to make sure people were supported, which means I was not nurturing my relationship. So I can hold my piece of responsibility there for sure. But also, he was not being honest about the fact that the way that I look today changed the way that he felt about me. Right. That as a gay man, and this is not everybody's story, but it's my story, and I don't want to put fear into people who are trying to manage a relationship that they got into prior to transition. But for me, my relationship didn't survive. And, it was easy for me to find recovery when I knew that I had a home and a partner and all of these things that I felt supported me in my work behind me. Yeah. And so the second that started to melt away, I felt like I had no one to talk to. So I had created all these resources for people like me and then couldn't access them myself. Yeah. Because of fear out of how people would react if they knew that I was, first of all, vulnerable, flawed. They had this expectation that I dressed like I'm dressed today, put on the suit, put it all together, stand on a stage and be inspiring, show the strength. And today I understand it differently because I did go back to my substance use disorder did rear its ugly head again. And it took about a year of in and out of trying to figure out how to support myself again through this process because I spent too much time trying to hide it. Trying to hide it. And the more I tried to hide it, the less likely it was that I was actually going to get the help that I needed. So in and out, just trying to manage the day-to-day operations of an agency that is growing leaps and bounds without the resources to actually back up the work that we're doing, traveling all over the country to do public speaking, training, all these things. And what I found is, I'm standing on a stage, now divorced, standing on a stage. Nobody knows I'm divorced still at this time. Right. Nobody knows that I'm back. And I'm not trying to be dishonest. I was still telling my story to the best of my ability. But nobody knows that I'm struggling with substance use disorder again. And I'm standing on a stage and people are coming up to me afterwards and saying, I love you so much. You'll never know how much you helped me. And then I go back to a hotel room. Sorry. And I'm sitting there and I thought, I have never felt more alone in my life. Yeah. And it's weird because there's all these people around me. And it was because I had no relationship with myself anymore. I didn't know who I was. I didn't love who I was. Yeah. And I wouldn't definitely allow myself the gift of feeling the things that people were saying to me. And so, it took some pretty dire things to take place in my life, and I don't want to go too much into those things today in order for me to humble myself enough to be able to say, this is what's happening. I'm not coming back to work until I'm well, and I'm going to get help no matter what the cost. And so in January of this year was when I had that conversation. And when I reached out back to Westover, House of Self-Esteem here in Windsor first. And I will say that, because I had such a struggle before getting into services that were inclusive, I do want to give credit where credit is due. And the House of Self-Esteem here in Windsor-Essex, I went to their outpatient trauma program because I sustained a lot of trauma throughout addiction prior the previous time and now. So I went to that program first, outpatient for 4 weeks, graduated that. Did not stay sober, just completely honest, did not stay sober. And then went into Westover in March. And I something changed there. And I'm not going to say it's going to be perfect. And it wasn't perfect since I got out either. I'm not even trying to claim that. So something changed there. But I think what changed the most is I learned that nobody else can bring me my joy. That has to come from me.
Absolutely.
That I am the author of my own story, but I'm also responsible for my own story. And I have the right to share it with only whom I feel safe doing so. And that unless you are willing to get in the ring and to do the work that I'm doing, you have no right to judge my work or my journey. And so I choose to no longer live in guilt and shame. I choose to no longer be the narrative that I read in the comment section based on some great work that I've done in my life. I choose to allow myself to exist freely of other people's narrative of me. And so even though I've had a couple challenges since coming out of treatment, I see myself every day and I live in gratitude for my journey. I'm back to work. I'm feeling empowered to do the work that I'm doing, and I don't feel like I need to explain myself anymore. I just need to allow myself the space to exist. So that's us.
You know what? You and I met for the first time. What was the summer of 2018
in Ottawa.
And it was just by happenstance. I remember sitting in the larger room when some of the folks from other organizations were speaking, and you were at a table. Either we were at the same table or you were at a table very close by. And I remember watching you and seeing the passion that was just oozing out of you. And there was a breakout, and I was scheduled to be in one room. I was there doing a presentation on U equals U. But before my presentation, I was going to go in and check out some of the other presentations. And there was a mix up in rooms, and I ended up in your room completely by accident. It wasn't my intention, but I'm so glad I stayed and listened to your presentation and got to meet you. I felt this attraction to you like immediately. And I love the fact that we have been able to connect like this. And I was so grateful when we were touring with the Slay Stigma Tour in October, when we came to Windsor, to actually have a chance to come in and see the space that your organization had grown into, and see firsthand the changes that you had made and the work that you've been doing. I take my hat off to you. I think you are absolutely brilliant. You know I love you completely. I respect you endlessly. Your bravery in telling your story, and I love the fact that you make that very clear. It is your story, and because it's your story, like you say, you are really, unless you give someone else permission to tell your story, it is your story to tell. Your authentic story is the only truth that really can be shared if people really want to know who Jayce Carver is and the journey Jayce Carver has been on and continues to be on. And it's a journey that I'm grateful to have become a part of in some small way over the last couple of years that we've known one another. So I can't thank you enough for being on tonight's show. I think it's especially inspiring, given that while we are taping this on a Thursday, the show will air on the International Day Against Transgender, or against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia. And I think, let's face it, you've experienced a lot of that since the age of 4 on through the rest of your life. And while we have to wrap up the show because we sadly are running out of time, you are coming back on. We are doing this again. We are having a further conversation. Again, I really do appreciate you being on the show this evening, and I definitely want to have you back. So Jayce Carver, thank you so much for being a part of Let's Be Perfectly Queer. We will definitely be chatting more, and I encourage everyone to check out Jayce's website for retrans support in Windsor, and we'll have that up on the screen so folks will know how to contact you as well, Jayce. So thank you again for being with us tonight, and thank you for watching another episode of Let's Be Perfectly Queer on Rogers TV Barrie.